They refused her water because of her blood. He gave it anyway, and by sunrise, the land around his ranch would stand still under the weight of 300 silent shadows. Before we go on, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your town or state below, and if you believe kindness still matters out here, stay with me. The sun hung low over the Arizona flats, a dull copper coin pressed into a sky that hadn't seen rain in weeks. And Ethan Cole rode slow along the dry creek bed, his horse kicking up dust that smelled like old earth and heat, the kind that settles into your bones and makes a man quieter than he used to be. He wasn't looking for trouble, never did, just a rancher with a few head of cattle and more silence than company, the kind of man folks in town called steady but kept their distance from all the same. About 2 miles from his fence line, he saw her, at first just a shape against the glare, too still to be a traveler, too large to be anything he could name right away, and as he got closer, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of sage and something heavier, something like exhaustion. She was sitting in the dirt, back straight despite the way her shoulders sagged under the sun, her frame towering even-seated, wrapped in worn Apache cloth that caught the light in faded reds and browns. And her eyes, when they found him, didn't plead, didn't beg, they measured. Ethan slowed his horse to a stop about 20 feet away, far enough to show respect, close enough to see the dust clinging to her lips, the dryness there that spoke louder than words ever could. He had heard the talk in town just that morning, voices low but sharp, about how things were changing, about how helping the wrong person could cost more than a man had to give, about how the line between their world and the Apaches had grown thin and dangerous. Don't get involved, someone had said, leaning over a whiskey glass. You see one of them out there, you ride the other way. The memory hung in the air between them as real as the heat, and for a long moment, neither moved. Ethan's hand rested near his saddle horn, not on his gun. Never on his gun unless he had no other choice. And he studied her the way a man studies a storm on the horizon, trying to decide if it's coming for him or passing by. She didn't speak, just watched, her breathing slow but shallow, the kind that told a story without needing a single word. And when the wind picked up again, it lifted a strand of her dark hair, revealing the dryness at her throat, the faint tremor she didn't bother to hide. Ethan reached for his canteen, the leather worn smooth from years of use, the weight of it familiar in his hand, and for a second, he paused, just a second, long enough to hear every warning he'd ever been given echo through his mind. Then he stepped down from his horse, boots crunching softly against the dirt, and instead of closing the distance, he set the canteen on a flat stone between them and stepped back. No sudden moves, no reaching, just an offering placed where it could be taken or refused. The world seemed to hold its breath as she looked at the canteen, then back at him. And in that quiet, something shifted, something neither of them named. And when she finally reached forward, her movements deliberate, controlled, she picked up the water without breaking eye contact, as if weighing not just the gift, but the man who had chosen to give it. Ethan said nothing, just stood there in the heat, dust settling around his boots, watching as she lifted the canteen and took a slow drink, and somewhere far off, beyond the dry hills, an empty sky, something unseen had already begun to move. The canteen stayed in her hands longer than Ethan expected, not because she drank fast, but because she drank like someone who understood the value of every drop, slow and measured, as if the water itself carried meaning beyond survival. And when she lowered it, she did not wipe her mouth or speak right away. She simply studied him again, her gaze steady, searching for something deeper than the act itself. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, boots pressing into the dry ground, the leather of his gloves creaking softly as he rested his hands at his sides, giving her space the way a man does when he knows he has stepped into someone else's world without invitation. The sun had climbed higher now, pressing down on both of them, flattening shadows and pulling the color out of the land until everything looked bleached and distant, and still neither of them rushed the moment. She finally moved, not toward him, but around him, rising to her full height in one smooth motion that made his horse flick its ears and step back once, uneasy but controlled, and Ethan noticed then just how tall she truly was, how her presence seemed to change the air itself, like standing near a canyon edge where the ground feels different under your feet. She placed the canteen back on the stone exactly where he had left it, careful, deliberate, and then she reached beneath the folds of her clothing and drew out something small, something that caught the sunlight in a way that made Ethan narrow his eyes. It was a turquoise pendant, smooth and worn, wrapped in thin silver that had darkened with time, hanging from a simple leather cord, and she held it for a second. Between them, not offering it, not explaining it, just letting him see. Then she set it down beside the canteen and stepped back. Ethan did not reach for it right away, not because he was afraid, but because he understood that whatever this was, it was not a trade, not a payment. It was something else entirely, something that required him to choose whether to accept it or leave it where it lay. The wind shifted again, carrying a low sound from far out across the flats, not loud enough to name, but enough to make his horse turn its head and listen, and Ethan followed the motion instinctively, scanning the horizon where the land stretched empty and wide, nothing moving except heat waves bending the air. When he looked back, she was already walking away, her steps steady despite the exhaustion he had seen earlier, her figure growing smaller against the endless stretch of desert, and she did not look back, not once. Ethan stood there for a long moment, the silence settling in around him, heavier than before, as if something unseen had passed between them and left a mark he could not quite define. He crouched slowly, picking up the canteen first, feeling the warmth of the sun in the leather. Then his fingers hovered over the pendant, hesitating just long. Enough for that same warning from town to echo again in his mind. The quiet voices, the caution, the lines drawn between people. But the pendant did not feel like a warning. It felt like a question, and Ethan had never been a man who walked away from questions. He picked it up, the turquoise cool against his skin despite the heat, and for a brief second, something about its weight felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried more than stone and silver, as if it carried a story he had just stepped into without knowing the ending. Behind him, the wind fell still, and somewhere far beyond the reach of his sight, the land answered in a way he could not yet hear. By the time Ethan rode back toward his ranch, the sun had begun its slow drop westward, stretching long shadows across the cracked earth and turning the sky into layers of pale gold and fading blue. And yet something about the land felt different, not louder, not darker, just aware in a way he could not explain. The pendant rested in his pocket, its weight subtle but constant, like a thought that refused to leave, and every so often his fingers brushed against it without meaning to, as if checking to make sure it was still there, as if part of him already understood that losing it would mean more than losing an object. His ranch came into view just past a low rise, the familiar outline of his barn and windmill cutting against the horizon, steady and unchanged. But even from a distance, he could see his cattle gathered closer together than usual, clustered near the fence line instead of spread across the pasture, their heads low, their movements slow and uneasy. Ethan pulled the reins gently, guiding his horse down the slope, eyes scanning the ground, the fence, the sky, looking for signs that something had passed through, but the dust told no clear story, no tracks out of place, no broken lines, just the same dry stillness that had always been there. When he reached the gate, he paused, resting one hand on the worn wood, listening, not for noise, but for the absence of it, because even the windmill had slowed, its creaking rhythm softer than it should have been, as if the air itself had grown heavier. He dismounted and stepped through, boots landing with that familiar crunch, but the sound seemed to fade too quickly, swallowed by a quiet that pressed in from all sides. Inside the barn, the horses shifted in their stalls, not restless, not panicked, just alert, their ears turning toward the open door as he entered, watching him in a way that made him feel like a stranger stepping into his own space. Ethan moved through the routine without speaking, checking water troughs, running a hand along a fence post, adjusting a loose strap, the kind of small, steady actions that had shaped his days for years, but each movement felt slightly off, like a rhythm interrupted by something unseen. As the light outside dimmed, he stepped back onto the porch of his house, the wood warm under his boots from the day's heat, and he finally pulled the pendant from his pocket, holding it up against the last stretch of sunlight. The turquoise caught the light in a quiet way, not bright, not sharp, just steady, and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow down to that single point of color in his hand. He turned it over, studying the worn edges, the way the silver had been shaped by time and touch, and he realized then that this was not something new, not something made recently. It had been carried, kept, passed along, and whatever it meant, it had meaning long before it reached him. The air shifted again, just enough to lift the edge of his shirt, and Ethan looked out across his land, the wide stretch of open ground that had always felt like his, always felt like something he understood, and for the first time in years, he had the quiet sense that he was not alone out there, not in the way a man feels watched, but in the way a man feels recognized. He closed his hand around the pendant slowly, the metal pressing into his palm, grounding him in a moment that felt both ordinary and altered at the same time. And as the last light slipped behind the horizon, the silence settled. Deeper, not empty, not peaceful, but waiting, as if the night itself was holding its breath for something that had already begun to move toward him. The night did not come all at once. It settled in slow, like dust after a long ride, and Ethan sat on the edge of his porch with the pendant resting in his palm, turning it over again and again as if it might reveal something new under the dim glow of the lantern beside him. But it stayed the same, quiet, worn, patient. The sky stretched wide above him, scattered with stars that should have felt familiar, but even they seemed distant tonight, like they were watching from farther away than usual. He had lived on this land long enough to know its patterns, the way the wind moved after sunset, the way the insects filled the silence with a low hum, the way the cattle shifted and settled as the temperature dropped. But tonight, those patterns were broken in small, almost invisible ways. The insects were quieter, the wind came in short breaths instead of long, steady currents, and the cattle stayed close to the fence line, their shapes barely moving in the dark. Ethan leaned back slightly, the wood of the porch creaking under his weight, and listened harder, not with his ears alone, but with the kind of attention that comes from years of living alone, where noticing small changes could mean the difference between calm and trouble. Somewhere far out beyond the range of his lantern, there was a sound, faint, almost too soft to catch, like something brushing against the earth in a steady rhythm, not hurried, not scattered, but controlled. He sat still, letting the sound come to him instead of chasing it, and after a moment, it faded again, leaving only that same heavy quiet behind. His fingers closed around the pendant, and for the first time since he had picked it up, he slipped the cord over his head, letting it rest against his chest beneath his shirt, not as a claim, not as ownership, but as acceptance, as if the act itself answered a question he had not fully understood until now. The air shifted once more, cooler this time, carrying with it a faint scent that did not belong to his ranch, something like smoke and sage, distant but unmistakable, and Ethan stood slowly, stepping off the porch and onto the dry ground, his boots pressing into the dirt with that same soft crunch, though even that sound seemed muted. He walked a few steps out into the open, eyes adjusting to the dark, scanning the edges of his land where the horizon blurred into shadow, and again, he felt it, not fear, not danger, but presence, like standing in a room where someone else had just been, the air still holding the trace of them. He did not reach for his rifle leaning by the door, did not call out, did not break the silence with anything that might turn this moment into something it was not. Instead, he stood there, steady and quiet, letting the land speak in its own way. The hours passed without him noticing, the lantern burning lower behind him, the stars shifting overhead, and every so often, that faint rhythm returned, a distant, measured movement that never came close enough to see, never loud enough to name. By the time the horizon began to pale with the first hint of dawn, Ethan was still standing there, the pendant resting against his chest, the weight of it now familiar. And as the light slowly revealed the outline of his fields and fences, something in the air changed again. Not sudden, not sharp, just a quiet certainty settling over the land, the kind that comes before something reveals itself. Ethan drew a slow breath, eyes fixed on the far edge of his property, and waited. The first light of dawn did not break the silence. It revealed it, stretching thin across the land like a sheet pulled tight, and Ethan stood where he had not moved for hours, his boots rooted in the same patch of dust, his eyes fixed on the far edge of his property where the horizon had begun to take shape again. At first, there was nothing, just the pale wash of morning pushing back the night. The outlines of fence posts and scrub brush slowly returning to the world, and then he saw it. Not movement, not exactly, but a difference in the way the light settled, as if something stood between him and the rising sun. He narrowed his eyes slightly, taking a step forward, the pendant cool against his chest now that the air had shifted with the morning, and the shape became clearer, then another beside it, then another, until the horizon was no longer empty. Figures, still as the land itself, spaced with intention, not scattered, not wandering, but placed, each one a mark against the growing light. Ethan did not reach for a weapon, did not call out. He simply watched as the distance between understanding and reality closed slowly, like a curtain lifting 1 inch at a time. There were more than a handful, more than a dozen, more than he could count at a glance, and none of them moved. Not a step, not a shift, just standing there in the early light, their silhouettes dark against the pale sky. The cattle behind him had gone quiet, completely quiet now, their usual low sounds gone, replaced by a stillness that matched the line at the horizon, and even the wind seemed to hold back, as if it knew better than to disturb what was unfolding. Ethan took another slow step forward, then another, his boots leaving shallow prints in the dust, and with each step, the shapes sharpened, resolving into men on horseback, their forms tall and steady, their presence unmistakable. They were not advancing, not closing the distance, just standing, watching, waiting. The number grew clearer as the light strengthened. Rows behind rows, stretching farther than he had first realized, not scattered across the land but forming a wide arc around his ranch, a quiet circle drawn in the dirt without a single line being marked. Ethan let out a slow breath he had not realized he had been holding, his chest rising and falling once, steady, controlled, and his gaze moved across them, left to right, taking in the scale of what stood before him. 300, maybe more, though he did not need an exact number to understand what it meant. This was not chance, not coincidence. This was intention carried across miles of land and brought to rest at his doorstep. The pendant shifted slightly against his chest as he moved, catching for a brief second on the fabric of his shirt, and that small sensation grounded him in a way nothing else could, reminding him of the moment that had led here, of the choice made without expectation, without calculation. The riders remained silent, no voices, no gestures, not even the sound of shifting leather or restless horses, just a line of presence drawn across the morning. And in that silence, there was no anger, no chaos, only something heavier, something deliberate. Ethan stopped a few yards from his porch, standing in the open, the rising sun now fully behind those distant figures, turning them into dark outlines edged with light. And he understood then that whatever this was, it had already begun long before he saw it, long before the night had settled over his land, long before he had taken that canteen into his hands. The land between them stretched wide and empty, but it no longer felt like distance. It felt like space held, like a breath waiting to be released, and Ethan Cole stood there, alone in the center of it, not as a man surrounded, but as a man being measured, in a silence that spoke louder than any words ever could. No one moved first, and that was the part that settled deepest into Ethan's chest, not fear, not threat, but the weight of restraint. 300 riders holding still in a land where movement was everything, where a single shift could change the meaning of a moment, and yet they remained as they were, silent, deliberate, watching. Ethan took one slow breath, then another, and stepped forward off the worn dirt path toward the open space between his house and the fence line, his boots pressing into the ground with a sound that felt louder now, not because it was, but because everything else had gone so quiet. The pendant rested against his chest, unmoving, but he felt it there with every step, a reminder of the choice that had led him here, and for a brief moment, he wondered if this was what the men in town had meant, not danger in the way they spoke of it, but consequence, something that arrives without raising its voice. He stopped halfway between his porch and the open field, far enough to show he was not hiding, close enough to show he was not leaving, and he let his hands rest at his sides, open, visible, the way a man stands when he has nothing to prove and nothing to hide. Across the distance, the line of riders did not break, but something within it shifted, not in motion, but in focus, as if attention itself had turned toward him, like the eye of a storm finding its center. A single rider near the middle moved forward then, not quickly, not dramatically, just a quiet separation from the line, her horse stepping with a calm that matched the stillness of the morning, and even from that distance, Ethan recognized her before the details came into view, not by face, not by clothing, but by the way she carried herself, the same steady presence he had seen in the dust the day before. Nahima. She rode alone across the open stretch, the space between them narrowing with each measured step of her horse, and as she approached, the light caught her again, revealing the strength in her posture, the quiet control in her movements. Nothing wasted, nothing rushed. She stopped about 30 feet from him, the distance chosen with the same care he had shown before, and for a moment, neither spoke, the land itself holding that silence like something sacred. Ethan's gaze met hers, steady, unflinching, not challenging, not yielding, just present, and he noticed then that the weariness he had seen before was gone, replaced by something clearer, something resolved. She glanced briefly at his chest, at the place where the pendant rested beneath his shirt, and something in her expression shifted, not softened, not hardened, just acknowledged. Then she spoke, her voice carrying across the distance without strain, calm and even, shaped by a language older than the fences that cut across this land. You kept it. Ethan nodded once, the movement small but certain. I did. The words felt simple, but they carried the weight of everything that had followed. She studied him for another long second, as if measuring not just his answer, but the truth behind it, and then she inclined her head. Slightly, not a bow, not submission, but recognition. Behind her, the line of riders remained unchanged, but the silence had shifted again, no longer waiting, no longer uncertain, but settled into something that felt like decision. Ethan did not ask why they had come, did not demand explanation, because standing there, with the morning light stretching across the land and 300 silent witnesses behind her, he understood that whatever answer he was meant to receive would not come in the form of words, and Nahima, still mounted, still steady, held his gaze just long enough to make that truth clear before the moment moved forward without either of them needing to say another thing. The silence did not break when she finished speaking. It deepened, like the moment after a door is opened but before anyone steps through, and Ethan remained where he stood, the morning light now fully settled across his land, casting long, steady lines that seemed to connect him to every rider beyond the fence. Nahima did not move her horse forward, did not close the distance further, and that restraint carried meaning, the same kind of meaning as the water left on the stone the day before, an offering without force, a presence without demand. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, the leather of his boots pressing into the dust, and he reached up once, briefly, touching the place where the pendant rested beneath his shirt, not to show it, not to display it, but to acknowledge it, the way a man might touch a memory to remind himself it is real. Nahima's eyes followed the movement, and for the first time, there was something like a quiet confirmation in her gaze, not approval, not relief, just recognition that what had been given had been received in the way it was meant to be. Behind her, the line of riders remained unbroken, but now Ethan could see more clearly the details. That distance had hidden before, the way their posture mirrored one another, the stillness shared across all of them, not rigid, not forced, but chosen, as if each man there understood that what was happening did not require motion to be understood. A breeze moved lightly across the field, just enough to stir the edges of clothing, to lift a bit of dust from the ground, and even that small movement seemed to pass through them without changing their stance. Nahima turned her head slightly then, not away from Ethan, but toward the riders behind her, and though she did not raise her voice, did not signal with her hands, something in that small shift carried outward, like a ripple moving across still water. Ethan felt it more than saw it, the way attention moved across the line, the way the air itself seemed to align with her presence, and for a brief moment, the land no longer felt divided between them, no fences, no boundaries, just one wide stretch of ground, holding a single moment in place. Then, slowly, deliberately, Nahima placed her hand over her heart, the gesture simple, unadorned, and held it there for a breath that seemed to last longer than it should have. Ethan watched, not moving, not responding immediately, because he understood instinctively that this was not a command, not something to mirror without thought, but something to be understood first. The pendant rested against his chest, and after that same quiet pause, he lifted his hand and placed it over his heart as well, not perfectly matching her motion, not trying to imitate, just answering in the only way that felt honest to him. The space between them held that exchange, silent, steady, complete in a way words could not have made clearer. Behind her, one by one, without sound, without urgency, the riders followed, each placing a hand over their chest in the same quiet gesture, until the entire line stood in that shared stillness. 300 men connected not by movement, but by intention. Ethan felt the weight of it then, not as pressure, not as fear, but as something larger than himself, something that had begun with a single moment and had grown without noise into something that now stood across his land. Nahima lowered her hand first, her gaze still on him, and gave the smallest nod, barely more than a shift in posture, but enough to mark the end of that moment. Ethan lowered his hand as well, the gesture complete, and in the silence that followed, there was no question left in the air, no uncertainty waiting to be resolved, only the quiet understanding that whatever had been measured had already been decided. Nothing rushed after that moment, and that was what made it settle so deeply into the land, not as an event, but as something accepted, something placed where it belonged. Nahima remained where she was for a breath longer, her eyes steady on Ethan, and in that stillness, there was a quiet shift that did not need words to be understood, as if whatever had brought them here had reached its end without needing to explain itself. She turned her horse slightly then, not away from him in dismissal, but in completion, the kind of movement that closes a circle rather than breaks it. And as she did, the light caught her again, revealing something Ethan had not seen before, not in her size, not in her strength, but in the calm certainty that settled in her posture, the kind that comes from carrying responsibility larger than oneself. She was not just a woman crossing the desert, not just someone he had helped without thinking. She was something more, someone who stood at the center of those 300 riders not by force, but by trust. Ethan saw it clearly now, the way they held their distance, the way they had waited without question, the way they had mirrored her gesture without hesitation, and it changed the shape of everything that had come before. The pendant against his chest no longer felt like an object given in passing. It felt like a mark, not ownership, not obligation, but recognition, as if by accepting it, he had stepped into a space where his actions carried weight beyond his own land. Nahima guided her horse back toward the line, each step measured, unhurried, and as she returned to her place, the riders made space for her without shifting their formation, the line absorbing her presence as if it had always been there. For a moment longer, they all remained as they were, the silence stretching out one last time, not tense, not uncertain, but complete. Then, without a single word, without a raised hand or spoken command, the line began to dissolve, not in disorder, but in perfect quiet, each rider turning their horse in a different direction, the wide arc breaking apart into smaller paths that led back across the land from which they had come. There was no dust kicked up in haste, no sound of urgency, just the soft, steady movement of horses stepping away, one by one, until the space that had been filled with presence began to open again. Ethan did not move to follow, did not step forward or call out. He simply stood where he was, watching as the shapes grew smaller, the details fading back into distance, the line that had surrounded his ranch thinning until it became part of the horizon once more. Nahima was the last to leave, her horse pausing for a brief moment at the edge of his land, and she turned her head slightly, not fully, just enough that he could see her profile against the morning light. There was no smile, no signal, no gesture to mark the moment, just that same steady presence he had first seen in the dust. And then she faced forward again and continued on, her figure gradually blending into the wide, open stretch of desert. The land settled after they were gone, the wind returning in slow, familiar currents, the cattle shifting and spreading out again, the ordinary sounds of the ranch rising back into place as if nothing had happened, and yet everything felt different. Ethan stood there for a long time after the last rider disappeared, the pendant resting against his chest, the memory of that silence still holding its shape around him. And he understood then, without needing to name it, that what had passed across his land that morning was not a warning, not a threat, but something far quieter, far stronger, something that did not need to stay to leave its mark. The land did not return to what it had been, not entirely, and Ethan felt that first in the quiet moments that followed, when the last trace of hoofbeats had faded and the horizon had swallowed every figure that had stood there at dawn. He walked the length of his fence line that morning, not because anything needed fixing, but because something in him needed to understand the shape of his own land again, to see it with eyes that had watched 300 riders stand without a single word. The cattle had spread out once more, grazing in slow, steady patterns, their unease gone as if it had never been there, and the windmill had found its rhythm again, creaking softly in the breeze like it always had, but the air carried something different now, something settled, something that did not need to move to be present. Ethan paused near the gate where he had first stopped the day before, his hand resting on the same worn wood, and he looked out across the open stretch beyond, the same dry earth, the same distant hills. Nothing changed, and yet everything understood differently. He reached up and pulled the pendant free from beneath his shirt, letting it rest in his palm again, the turquoise catching the midday light in that same quiet way, and he turned it slowly, not searching this time, not questioning, just holding it as it was meant to be held. It did not belong to him, not in the way a tool or a piece of land belongs to a man, but it stayed with him all the same, a mark of a moment that had passed without needing to be claimed. Days moved on, the way they always do, marked by sunrise and sunset, by cattle to tend, and fences to check, by the steady work that fills a man's hands and leaves his thoughts to settle where they will. And nothing like that morning returned, no riders, no silence that heavy, no presence drawn across his land in that way. But word traveled, as it always does, carried by men who noticed things they could not explain, by traders who passed through and spoke in lowered voices about a ranch that no one bothered anymore, about land that seemed to be left alone without reason. Ethan heard it in town a week later, standing near the edge of a conversation he had not joined, men speaking about boundaries, about how some places were better left untouched, and he said nothing, not because he had something to hide, but because there was nothing to explain. He rode back to his ranch that evening with the same steady pace, the same quiet understanding settling in him again as the land opened up before him. And when the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched long, he stood once more on his porch, looking out across the wide, empty space that no longer felt empty. The pendant rested against his chest, warm now from the day's heat, and he let his hand rest over it for a moment, not out of habit, not out of need, but out of recognition, somewhere far beyond his sight, beyond the hills and the dry riverbeds. Life continued in ways he would never see, and yet a single moment had bridged that distance without words, without force, without anything more than a choice made in the heat of a long day. Ethan lowered his hand and looked out across his land one last time before stepping inside, the door closing softly behind him, and the night settling in as it always did, quiet, steady, unchanged on the surface, but carrying beneath it a truth that did not need to be spoken, that out here, in a place where men often believed strength was measured by what they could take, it was something else entirely that endured, something quieter, something that did not raise its voice, but stayed all the same.